Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Today we have a special episode, a duet of minds, so to speak. I'm very happy to be able to welcome David from Polyglot Reading to join today's episode. In past episodes, he's made lots of thought-provoking and insightful comments, and if you need evidence of that, just go back to episode 18. Now, he suggested to me, what about doing a collaborative episode? And I thought, well, that's perfect. Perfect because George Eliot's writing is so dense. There's so much knowledge in it, so much literary, historical, scientific knowledge that, frankly, I don't think you can bring too many minds to the analysis of the text. Now, our format today is going to work such that we will alternate our presentation back and forth. We've divided the text between us, and that's purely so that we don't get in the way of each other's lines of thought. Doesn't mean, though, that while we're commenting on our bit of text, we can't comment on anything else in the section. Absolutely. And I expect that there will be nerdy diversions, quotations, the usual thing that you've come to expect from Middlemarch meditations. So, David, I'm going to move away from the mic now and let you introduce yourself to everyone.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Heather, so for having me here with you today. I'm a great admirer of your Middlemarch meditations, and so it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to do this joint close reading together with you. And I hope that your viewers and subscribers will enjoy this new format. And at least for me personally, already preparing for this joint session was already a really great pleasure. Okay, so you asked me to introduce myself a little bit. I'm happy to do so, and I've prepared a nerd slide with a few facts on my own. So yeah, I'm David. You may already have noticed that I'm not a native English speaker. I'm German. A fun fact about me, I was born on the 29th of February, so I'm still quite young. This 2024 will be my first year as a teenager. My professional background, I'm an environmental scientist, and I'm a book nerd, and I'm a language learner. And these latter two hobbies I'm trying to combine in my tiny new booktube channel, which I opened on the 1st of January. So where I focus on books that I read in their original language, either German, English, Italian, Yiddish, or French. And my focus is mostly on classics and a bit of nonfiction. And I'm trying to do also the videos in four of the languages that I speak, also to practice my language a little bit. Yeah, and what do I bring with me to this joint session, joint close reading of Middlemarch? You may have noticed, as an environmental scientist, I have no formal education in literature studies or in humanities at all. It's just a hobby for me. But I may bring with me some weird and nerdy science facts. And I think based to the scientific training, I think I have some sort of special attention to details. And I'm just curious about any references to culture, arts, religion, and nature in any literary text. And yeah, I am easily tempted to go down rabbit holes, and sometimes a little bit too easily tempted. So if my imagination runs wild and I'm starting to throw in just wild conjectures, then Heather will have the burden to stop me and to say, no, that's not, there's no supporting evidence in the text. Let's get back to Middlemarch. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
David, just it may comfort you to know that the person who watches television has a degree in physics and chemistry as well as history. So nerdy diversions, a lot of those happen in this house. So we'll get underway, everybody. I'm going to start sharing the screen now. We will get started with chapter 9, page 73 of this Penguin Classics edition. And we're starting off with another one of these epigraphs, these funny little bits of text, which in the 19th century, it was very popular to use them at the heads of chapters. This particular one is Eliot doing another one of her inventions. You'll remember that it was back in chapter 4 that we had this little dialogue between first gentleman and second gentleman, a completely fictitious one. You might be interested to know, we'll start a nerdy diversion right now. Let's do a rabbit hole on epigraphs. And that is to say that out of curiosity, I reviewed all the epigraphs in Middlemarch. And the two gentlemen have a total of 5 exchanges. So we're going to meet them again in chapters 13, 28, and 34. What I'm going to look at first is an article. I'm going to put in the description box a link to an article by David Leon Higdon, which is about George Eliot and the art of the epigraph, because she loved these, but she didn't necessarily always love quoted text. So while she liked epigraphs, and David Higdon says that Eliot created 225 epigraphs throughout all her writing, of which 96 she created herself and 129 are quotations from other works. Even though she loved epigraphs, she hated quotations within the text. Amongst all her correspondence, there's a letter to the biographer Alexander Maine, where she says to him, by way of advice, as to quotations, please be very moderate. And later on in the same letter, she says, I hate a style that's speckled with quotations. And I wondered to myself, what was it she disliked? She obviously had no problem with a piece of writing being quoted, provided it didn't interrupt the text. And I presume that what troubled her was the fact that very often quotations changed font in a Victorian book. They were very often italicized. They could often be in another language, which may not have been a problem for Eliot. I'm trying to remember how many languages she knew. She did know German, and I believe she tried to teach herself Latin. David, you may interrupt here because it's only German and Latin that I'm sure that she knew.
I think
But
she
I
knew
believe
also at least two other ancient languages, Greek and Hebrew. And I think also some other European languages. I am pretty sure that she also knew French and Italian a little bit.
So she probably French was one of those things that all young ladies had to learn to speak a little of to be considered accomplished. What she may have been bothered about too was that where you had a quotation in any old text, you would have then a note number, and very often footnotes appeared as part of the same page. And so it could create, and with older books you can see this, where sometimes the footnote takes up so much space that there really is only about a paragraph of text. So perhaps what she disliked was the breaking up of the flow of the text itself. So we will hear what the two gentlemen have to say to each other. First gentleman says, an ancient land in ancient oracles is called law-thirsty. All the struggle there was after order and a perfect rule. Pray, where lie such lands now? To which the second gentleman replies, why, where they lay of old, in human souls. We really don't know who the ancient land or the ancient oracles is, but there has been some speculation. And again, there'll be a second link down in the description box to an anthropology professor at Columbia University, Rosalind Morris, who says that it's very likely that what Eliot was thinking of here was the recently translated Persian sacred texts, which at that time were known as the Zend Avesta. She feels it's very likely, I don't know if she was going on biographical information or a letter where Eliot mentioned that she was reading it. And I did need David's help here because I couldn't find online evidence that the Zend Avesta had been translated into English any earlier than the 1880s. Eliot would have been writing Middlemarch in the late 1860s. So David kindly did some research and suggested a couple of possibilities. Either she read Dr. Friedrich Spiegel's German translation from 1852, or Arthur Henry Bleek's English translation, which could have been the English translation from the Persian or the English translation from the German, and that was 1864. She could have read either of them. What she's referring to is the Persian concept of a perfect land or a perfect place. There'll be a banner up here on screen to inform you of what ought to have been in my note. But at any rate, there was a society that was looking for the perfect rule of law and order. And I think what Eliot is doing here is leading nicely into the very first sentence of the text. Mr. Casaubon's behavior about settlements was highly satisfactory to Mr. Brooke, and the preliminaries of marriage rolled smoothly along, shortening the weeks of courtship. Settlement refers to a marital agreement, but unlike most prenuptial agreements today, which would be made between the prospective husband and the prospective wife, these would always have been made between the fathers or guardian of the respective two. And the point of it was to manage the assets of both sides of the family and to ensure that whatever children came from it were suitably provided for. Or should there anything happen, should there not be a male heir, it covered all kinds of possible situations. And you can see my note here. I've said inexpensive. Gathering from all the other quotes about Mr. Brooke that other people have made, I presume that possibly the satisfactory nature of the settlement was that it wasn't as expensive as it might have been. The next sentence, though, the betrothed bride must see her future home. I haven't seen this in any other 19th century novel that I've read, of the betrothed bride having to go see her future home before her marriage so that she can talk about any changes that she wants to make. The nearest thing I can think is Charles Dickens' Bleak House, where Esther Summerson is taken to visit a house, but she doesn't realize it's going to be the house that she will live in as a married woman. That's a little bit indirect, but apparently I'm going to take Eliot's word that this was a custom. And Eliot goes on to say, or her narrator goes on to say, with tongue firmly in cheek, a woman dictates before marriage in order that she may have an appetite for submission afterwards, which apparently she needs to get that out of her system, and then she'll be fine. And certainly the mistakes that we male and female mortals make when we have our own way might fairly raise some wonder that we are so fond of it. So ending on a little joke there. In other words, even when we think we're going to get what we want, we don't really get what we want. David's going to take the microphone now, and we are going to walk in and visit that future home.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heather. Before we move on, may I ask something about the first paragraph and the epigraph? And may I comment?
Yes.
And if it's not appropriate, you may edit it out. So first about the epigraph, when I read it, I thought that there were actually two different levels of the meaning. This thirst for rule and order, I think it matches nicely what you explain, the rule and order in the economic settlements. That makes a lot of sense. But then in the end, there's this twist to the human soul. And to me, this brought to my mind what Dorothea mentioned earlier about her expectations, what she was, the thirst that she had for a husband to whom she could look up and who was going to teach her. So that sort of order and perfect rule by a husband who is her intellectual superior and who could guide her and teach her Hebrew and ancient languages and so on. And I thought that this might be a second level that is addressed here in this epigraph. Probably with Eliot, it's often so that she also was thinking not just of one way street of implications, but. And the second thing is you mentioned these dialogues of the first and the second gentleman appear 5 times in the novel. I didn't notice that. I'm just curious if you just cut out these 5 dialogues between the two gents and put them in a sequence. Do they make any sense as a sort of dialogue in its own, or is there no connection between these 5 pieces of dialogue between them? So that would be an interesting thing to check.
Leave that with me, David. I will try that.
Okay, let's move on in the text. On a grey but dry November morning, Dorothea drove to Lowick in company with her uncle and Celia. Let's stop right here after the sentence. So this will be a two-hour session today. 2 things come to my mind in this sentence. So first, Eliot starts talking about the weather conditions here. And we will see this all throughout the following paragraphs of that chapter, that there are many references to nature, to weather or climate, and to plants and stones. And considering that this is a key chapter, at least with regards to Dorothea's marriage to Casaubon, I'm quite sure that these references are not just coincidentally as nice filling material, but I think that Eliot uses these on purpose, being well aware of the power of these elements as either symbols or to create a specific atmosphere that foreshadows how this marriage will turn out to be. And so gray and November is anything but lively and promising. And the second thing is the name of the property. Again, maybe this is a misleading rabbit hole. As a non-native speaker, one may see sound connections where there aren't any, but my immediate association was Lowick, Low-wick. So is this something like an extinguishing wick, so a candle that is about to go out? Which is, again, not a good omen for the home of a groom shortly before the wedding. So just maybe this is conjecture, but to me that this association was very imminent. Mr. Casaubon's home was the manor house. Close by, visible from some parts of the garden, was the little church, with the old parsonage opposite. In the beginning of his career, Mr. Casaubon had held only the living, but the death of his brother had put him in possession of the manor also. So this provides a bit more context to the economic situation of the Casaubon family. So Mr. Casaubon is obviously the owner of this manor and obviously the only heir of the family property, since we already learned that his sister was disinherited and his brother deceased. So I think that just links back to the opening of the chapter that you explained so nicely, Heather, where we are told that Casaubon's behavior, about the settlement was satisfactory. So he's apparently well off. And from the economic point of view, we might expect perfect order and rule from the material perspective. It had a small park with a fine old oak here and there, and an avenue of limes towards the southwest front, with a sunk fence between park and pleasure ground, so that from the drawing room windows the glance swept uninterruptedly along a slope of greensward till the limes ended in a level of corn and pasture, which often seemed to melt into a lake under the setting sun. This starts to become interesting. There's a lot of references to plants and to nature here, and very tempting for me to analyze this in more detail. And I'll come to the two tree species, oaks and limes, in a minute. But before that, we notice that there are some indications of neglect and decline, a sunk fence. So I see some first gentle hints that this is not a place thriving. And now to the trees. So there are these two tree species mentioned, oaks and limes, with also some interesting details about their different spatial arrangement. The oaks here and there, and an avenue of limes. And I did some research on the symbolic meaning of these two tree species, at least in the European context. And this turns out to be quite interesting. I'd like to share something with you. Okay, so I use a dictionary of symbolism to find some details about the symbolic meaning of these trees. And so first, the oak trees scattered here and there. And according to this dictionary of symbolism that I consulted on this matter, the oak tree, at least in Europe, is often seen as a symbol of masculinity, of age and solidity, but also of inflexibility. And I think that it's not too far-fetched to associate these oak trees with Mr. Casaubon. And this becomes even more convincing if we look at the symbolic meaning of the lime or linden tree, because this actually is often used as a symbol for femininity, fertility, of summer. Just think of the sweet-scented blossom of the linden tree. It usually blooms in early summer, but is a tree that is actually very robust. It can also stand very rough climate and frosty winters. And then we have this difference in the spatial arrangement. So we have the oak trees that are scattered here and there. They're not leading anyway, not leading anywhere, but the lime trees, they form an avenue that leads to a level of corn and pastures melting into a lake under the setting sun. So the lime trees may be a symbol of Dorothea. There's a perspective. So there is leading away something from the gloomy house to a more fertile and idyllic nature. Maybe there's a little bit of conjecture in that, but on the other hand, if we have a chapter circling around a bride and a groom, and we have a symbol for masculinity and femininity, so there might be something behind that I think we could move on with the text. So this was the happy side of the house, for the south and east looked rather melancholy even under the brightest morning. The grounds here were more confined, the flower beds showed no very careful tendons, and large clumps of trees, chiefly of sombre hues, had risen high, not 10 yards from the windows. If the house looked melancholy even under the brightest morning, remember that we are actually visiting the manor on a grey November day. So imagine how gloomy it must have appeared to the Brooks when they arrived here. And the flower beds showed no careful attendance. So imagine a neglected flower bed in November when most flowers are withered and wet and decomposing anyway. So usually this is just a slimy, brownish, gray heap of matter. So something that definitely adds to the bleakness of the scenery. And if these things are not well attended to, it also tells us that evidently Casaubon does not seem to have an eye and caring for the material world and its beauties. Not a big surprise to us, I reckon. We have a third tree species here, hues, or more precisely, somber hues, as Eliot phrases it. And this adds even more strongly to the dark and gloomy atmosphere and triggers already some misgivings. It's not only the effect on the house, because large clumps of yew trees not 10 yards from the windows will definitely have a strong darkening effect on the rooms in this part of the house all year long, because yews are evergreen trees of a very dark green. So not even in the winter sun will get into the house, but the yew trees will block the light. And on top of that, yew trees also have very somber symbolic meaning. Switch to presentation. The yew tree is very strongly associated with death. A couple of reasons, because almost all parts of the plant are deadly poisonous. Even a small amount, if ingested, will kill. And the wood of the yew tree is also traditionally used to produce deadly weapons like longbows and spears, because it's a very flexible but almost unbreakable type of wood. So there's a very, very strong association with death. So there's a second feature of the yew trees, because yew trees can be trimmed in almost any shape and form. Picked a few nice pictures on the internet. So I think in the 19th century, at least in Germany, it was very popular in parks to trim yew trees into geometrical forms. Again, I wonder whether this is something that Eliot wants to hint at. Is Dorothea going to be pruned and trimmed to fit into the Casaubon world? So is she in danger of being distorted to fit into the worldview and the life habits of this bachelor Casaubon? At least I can think that a writer of Eliot's caliber was not unaware of these connotations, and so I'm sure she did not use the yew trees accidentally and unintentionally. So a deep dive into a rabbit hole about tree species. We promised you it will be nerdy today. Okay, let's move on. So the building of greenish stone was in the Old English style. Not ugly, but small-windowed and melancholy looking. The sort of house that must have children, many flowers, open windows, and little vistas of bright things to make it seem a joyous home. Greenish stone, that's another rabbit hole that was too tempting for me to be neglected. It is often said that the fictitious town of Middlemarch is probably in the Midlands, or more specifically in the Coventry area, where Eliot had been living before she moved to London. And so I couldn't help checking some geology maps of the Western Midlands to learn about the occurrence and use of greenish stone in that area. And there is a nice publication on this topic of the geology of Coventry, available by the organization The History of England. And it turns out, I checked this publication here, and it turns out that greenish building stones are far from common in that area. So again, it must be a deliberate choice by Eliot, or by the Casaubon ancestors who built the manor, because most sandstones used for building in that area are either of a brownish or a reddish color. And the greenish stones that are available here are not of a lively green, that could be a symbol of life and fertility, but again of a more somber hue. I picked out two pictures of buildings. I think one was provided by Heather to contrast the overall impressions that buildings with the greenish stone have compared to buildings with a more common brownish or reddish stone. And I think we do not need a degree in arts or psychology to see that the buildings with the greenish stone have an air of aloofness and melancholy and gloom, whereas it's much easier to imagine a cozy and welcoming atmosphere inside a house made of brownish or reddish stone. And the only way to make such a melancholy greenish building a joyous home are many flowers and children. And I think Eliot has already cast some serious doubts whether Casaubon can provide any of these. About the flowers, we've already seen from the neglected flower beds. He is not exactly the person with the green thumb. And with regard to children, well, we may remember the caustic remark made by Mrs. Cadwallader in the previous chapter that it's highly unlikely that Casaubon is capable of producing many lively offspring. So it gives us some misgivings about this marriage. Let's move on. In this latter end of autumn, with a sparse remnant of yellow leaves falling slowly athwart the dark evergreens in a stillness without sunshine, the house too had an air of autumnal decline, and Mr. Casaubon, when he presented himself, had no bloom that could be thrown into relief by that background. Stillness without sunshine, autumnal decline. I think these are keywords nicely summarizing the combined effect of all these small hints that Eliot has given us in this paragraph. And all this could without doubt be compensated by a charming and charismatic owner, but I think Eliot made it very clear that Casaubon is not exactly the Prince Charming who could counterbalance the melancholy that is represented by Lowick Manor and its park.
Well said, David. I had some thoughts as you were describing the oak trees and the limes and giving us the symbolism. I note also that Eliot has situated the oaks and the limes on one side of the house. Perhaps she was making a comment about Casaubon's family in the past. If you take the oak trees as representatives of male ancestors, there were one or two good sturdy oaks. But of the females, there's a line, unbroken line. Well, you know better than I do whether there's going to be anything to support the Casaubon ancestors as having stronger females. So let's go on into the next section, which is, oh dear, we're not surprised that she's not impressed with the manor house. As Celia said to herself, because she always keeps things to herself, she said, I am sure Freshet Hall would have been pleasanter than this. She thought of the white freestone, and here I'll stop. Freestone is simply talking about a quality of stone that is finer grained and therefore easier to cut, therefore more likely to be used for decorative purposes. So she thought of the white freestone, she thought of the pillared portico. The house that David had up on the photograph, the nicer one, the cheerier one, had a pillared portico, and the terrace full of flowers. And then she heads off into something that is quite uncelia-like, fantasy territory. She says, Sir James, smiling above them like a prince issuing from his enchantment in a rosebush, with a handkerchief swiftly metamorphosed from the most delicately odorous petals. And I'm going to stop there because she gets a little bit more ordinary now, but just for a moment she flew off into something fantastic. She's alluding to one of many fairy tales. European fairy tales morph and evolve and change and grow, and there are many which center around a rose prince and a thorn princess, or a prince who must make his way through some kind of enclosure of thorns to reach the princess. The one English modern version that we all know, but we probably don't recognize it because it's changed so much, is Sleeping Beauty. And I think if anybody remembers reading books with stories of Sleeping Beauty, they'll remember the princess's name was Briar Rose. So she's playing with this idea of fairy tales and turning Sir James into something quite different. Because it's not like Celia to be fanciful, this to me suggests that the small amount of attention that Sir James Chetham has been paying to her, which was alluded to in chapter 8, is having its effect. She is doing really what she ought to do. She's obeying convention in a sense. She's responding to being noticed in the way she ought. She understands that women are not meant to have agency. She's always very down on Dorothea with her notions. By notions, Celia means Dorothea keeps wanting to take action in the world. That's not common sense because everyone knows that the world of action is masculine. It belongs to men. What women are meant to do is to wait to become an object of an active man's attention. And at that point, you may return the favor. And then of course, you may become a domestic adjunct to whatever it is that the man is doing out in the world. And that's common sense to Celia. As far as she's concerned, that is how the world works. And so for the first time, she's actually allowing herself a little flight of fancy. David, we'll let you talk about Dorothea's first reaction to the house.
Okay. Dorothea, on the contrary, found the house and grounds all that she could wish. The dark bookshelves in the long library, the carpets and curtains with colors subdued by time, the curious old maps and bird's-eye views on the walls of the corridor, with here and there an old vase below, had no oppression for her, and seemed more cheerful than the casts and pictures at the Grange, which her uncle had long ago brought home from his travels, they being probably among the ideas he had taken in at one time. So Dorothea finds that this is all that she could wish, and to me, this already sounds a bit strange for a young bride. So it doesn't say this is fully to her taste, but for me, there's also already some first tinge of self-renunciation here. She cannot, or she dares not wish for more, and I wonder. So I wonder whether she thinks that she is not entitled to something better or something more. And I think everything that we can learn about the interior, about the subdued colors, old maps and old vases, that further corroborates the impression that this is not and never will be a lively home, but something where time has clearly left its mark or has even come to a sort of standstill. We also learn, not to our total surprise, that at the Grange, the pieces of art brought home and put on display by Mr. Brooke were not to Dorothea's taste either, probably because of her piety and her very serious character. And I think the following paragraph sheds a little bit more light on this. What sort of objects were on display in Dorothea's home? To poor Dorothea, these severe classical nudities and smirking Renaissance choreographies were painfully inexplicable, staring into the midst of her puritanic conceptions. She had never been taught how she could bring them into any sort of relevance with her life. But the owners of Lowick apparently had not been travelers, and Mr. Casaubon's studies of the past were not carried on by means of such aid. Let's stop here. I think this is, again, highly interesting. First, it's poor Dorothea. So Eliot, or the narrator, already feels pity for Dorothea, and I think no wonder why. And with regards to the pieces of art, there's a nice wordplay here, the choreographies. So on one, there is curiosities, so she couldn't interpret them or put them into context or get to their meaning, but choreographies clearly refers to the paintings of a very specific Italian painter of the Renaissance, Correggio, or more precisely Antonio da Correggio. And I'd like to show one of his best-known paintings that Eliot might have had in mind when she referred to Correggio here. And I think this painting is also highly relevant with regard to the final sentence in this paragraph about Mr. Casaubon's studies. Antonio da Correggio, a Renaissance painter, he painted many pictures with biblical scenes and Madonnas with the child and so on, but I think these do not fit well the description here where the narrator speaks of nudities in conflict with puritanic conceptions. But Correggio also painted some scenes from the Greek and Roman mythology, and one of the most famous paintings is this Leda and the Swan. And so this is the sort of picture we are talking about here, or Eliot is talking about here. And if you're wondering about what we can see here, yes, it is exactly what you think. So it's the Greek god Zeus under the disguise of a swan making love to Leda, fathering the twins Castor and Pollux. And I think this scene, erotic scene between a human and an animal, would have been very disturbing for a Puritan mind. And still illegal in the UK today. In particular, it's all these swans in open waters officially belong to the king. So you might get into trouble with many paragraphs of the penal code. So don't imitate at home. So these were very explicit scenes. And look at the right hand of the picture. Nobody seems to be upset by the scene. On the contrary, it's actually displayed as something entertaining. It looks like the friends of Leda are thinking that, oh, this looks like fun. Let's go for the other swans and do what Leda is doing. So on a more serious note, I think the important thing is that exactly stories like this are actually the key to antique mythology. And a person like Casaubon, who aiming at writing a key to the origin of all mythology and religion, he would be well advised to take a very close look at these mythologies and also their visual representations across the ages. But we learn, it's stated very explicitly, that his studies of the past were not carried on by means of such aids. And to me, this raises some very serious questions and some doubts on the methodology and meaningfulness of Casaubon's entire work that he is dedicating his whole life and all his energy to. To me, he seems, if he does not use this sort of visual representations, he seems to walk around with blinkers, so maybe even self-imposed ones. And if he does not look into these matters, what is all his research and study based on and aiming at? If it's just dusty books and old maps and bird views, as described above, then he will not get anywhere with his studies. So the attentive reader gets the impression that Casaubon is probably sort of a dried-in-the-wool yarn spinner who's not spinning real yarn, but just cobwebs out of his dusty books or chasing rainbows. But I think Casaubon's rainbows seem all to be black and white. So that's very small remarks, but very pungent remark that really put into question the whole work of Casaubon. I think he is building his theories on very questionable ground because he's not taking into account a whole field of evidence that should be essential and crucial to his field of study. And this relates very well also to the description earlier in the paragraph that all the tenants of Lowick Manor had not been travelers. So in this family, there has been no tradition of actually exploring and looking at the world beyond their confined little park. We're going further down this rabbit hole a little bit, another more nerdy angle. I think this brought to my mind a very spot-on quote from one of the most important natural scientists and explorers of Eliot's time, the German Alexander von Humboldt, because he constantly made a very strong point in many of his publications that we need to look very closely at the world before we form any theories. And he was very caustic on his colleagues who formed great theories about the natural world just based on the study of books and archives. And we know for sure that Eliot knew very well his works because she owned some of his books, even in the German original. And in the 1850s, when she lived in Berlin for 2 years, she actually lived in the very same street as Humboldt. I'd like to share one key quote from Humboldt. I think Eliot must have been familiar with that. The most dangerous worldview is the worldview of those who have never viewed the world. I think that is something that might be true for Casaubon. And I think there's even more to it because Eliot, given that she knew Humboldt very well, used him actually as a sort of model for Casaubon, but as a contrasting model because Humboldt, during the final decades of his life, had a similarly huge project as Casaubon. He wanted to write a huge compendium or sort of key to the physical geography of the whole world, a book in which he explains all the natural processes that determine for every given climate zone of the Earth how the specific combination of factors such as location, climate, geology determine the sort of ecosystem that develops and how they determine the flora and fauna. And he had a likewise ambitious title of his work. He named it Cosmos. So a key to everything, but not to the spiritual world, but about the physical world. And he actually achieved it. He was able to publish this so that two things in very strong contrast to Casaubon. He was focused on the physical world, not on the spiritual, but with the ambition to write the overall key to it and focusing not on studying archives, but in actually going out. So he explored for years. He was traveling all the world, exploring the Southern American continent, risking his life a couple of times. And then when he had all collected this evidence, he was able to produce such a universal key to the cosmos or the physical world in general. I think that Eliot must have had some people like him in mind as a contrast to Casaubon, because she was very familiar with his works and his key statements.
This is very interesting. I can't believe she wouldn't have read it. And as you say, given the work that was put into Cosmos, I can't see how she couldn't have been considering at least somewhat of him as a contrast. Yes, absolutely. Wow. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, but I'm going to try. I'm going to go back to the text. Okay, so we'll go on. Dorothea walked about the house with delightful emotion, difficult to understand. Everything seemed hallowed to her. This was to be the home of her wifehood, and she looked up with eyes full of confidence to Mr. Casaubon when he drew her attention specially to some actual arrangement and asked her if she would like an alteration. All appeals to her taste she met gratefully, but saw nothing to alter. His efforts at exact courtesy and formal tenderness had no defect for her. And now what I'll do is just change the page quickly. She filled up all blanks with unmanifested perfections, interpreting him as she interpreted the works of Providence, and accounting for seeming discords by her own deafness to the higher harmonies. And there are many blanks left in the weeks of courtship, which a loving faith fills with happy assurance. I'm going to quickly talk about that paragraph because Dorothea, just like Celia, seems to be operating under a kind of enchantment, except that hers is not based in fairy tales, as Celia's is. Hers is based in religion, quite literally. She doesn't perceive the contradiction of Casaubon's behavior. To have exact courtesy, there's a contradiction in that if you are being courteous to someone, you aren't cutting that off at the exact moment. If you are only doing what you feel is absolutely necessary to be courteous, it's not in the spirit of courtesy. And similarly, formal tenderness, they contradict each other. Formality means you are following rules. Therefore, you are responding to logic. Tenderness suggests, no, you are responding to feeling. So which is it? Is he formal or is he tender? And these are the blanks. And she's interpreting it in the same way. She's interpreting him as she interpreted the works of Providence. So interpreting everything about Casaubon as if he were himself a deity. And so applying to him the definition of faith that I can still remember from the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, which says faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. All the blanks, all the things she cannot see happening, i.e. the affection, which one would expect. She's simply saying, no, I have faith. It's my problem if I cannot perceive true affection from this man. Dorothea is creating a false faith. She is elevating Casaubon to the level of a deity, and she's setting herself up for so much disappointment, as we know, because she's going to marry a man. And what's going to happen inevitably is he's going to shrink. It's a horrible process for her to go through. What follows now is just an example of Dorothea simply not wanting to have anything changed. Mr. Casaubon wants to know, is there a room in the house she wants for her boudoir? Even Eliot comments, showing that his views of the womanly nature were sufficiently large to include that requirement. The narrator doesn't hide her feelings, if it is a her, but she's got a sharpness which suggests, yes, I've been through all this and I'm going to comment. And of course, Dorothea says it's very kind of Casaubon to think of her, but I assure you, I want everything decided for me. I want everything taken as it is. I have no motive for wishing anything else. I think it's wonderful. I think we're all relieved when Celia breaks in at last to stop this nonsense and says, no, I think you should try to make a choice, and comes in and makes a choice for her. Oh, Dodo, said Celia, will you not have the bow-windowed room upstairs? Now, whether or not Dorothea gets it, whether or not it's a nice room, there's other matters that David's going to discuss now. But I wonder, will Dorothea be grateful or ungrateful in the future that Celia stepped in and thought this is nonsense? David, what's coming up next?
Yeah, let's take a close look at this room that might be her future boudoir. So Mr. Casaubon led the way thither. The bow window looked down the avenue of limes. The furniture was all of a faded blue, and there were miniatures of ladies and gentlemen with powdered hair hanging in a group. A piece of tapestry over a door also showed a blue-green world with a pale stag in it. Again, faded blue, powdered hair, a pale stag, all this that breathes the air of times past, of a standstill, of fading away. The interesting point is, though, the view on the limes. So this is going to be Dorothea's room, and she will have a look on the trees, symbolizing femininity and life, and forming an avenue that leads back to nature, away from the house. So there is a first slight hint that there's hope for an escape for her into a more cheerful life, I guess. And I recommend to remember this scene with the view from the window, because this will actually play an important role in a couple of later chapters. In some other turning points in the novel, in the life of Dorothea, she will return to her boudoir and look out of the window and onto the scenery, and the way she perceives the scenery sort of reflecting her inner turmoil and so on. So the reader is well advised to stay on the lookout for further scenes in that boudoir, and how Dorothea looks at this landscapes and how this relates to her inner feelings. Okay, back to the room. The chairs and tables were thin-legged and easy to upset. So this is a room where you're not too supposed to live in a very lively manner. And it's difficult to imagine children playing and frolicking around in this room where they may easily upset the furniture. And it was a room where one might fancy the ghost of a tight-laced lady revisiting the scene of her embroidery. A light bookcase contained 12 volumes of polite literature in calf, completing the furniture. Oh dear, a ghost is not a good sign. And a lady that is tight-laced and doing embroidery. Okay, that maybe a lady that is not only tight-laced, but also tight-lipped, leading her life in a very conventional way, not an original thinker with own ideas, but trapped in tight lace, so trapped in conformism and just doing the things that one is supposed to do, strictly sticking to societal conventions. And if this is in any way representative of the mindset of Casaubon's mother, then we may get an idea of his upbringing and the sort of intellectual background or lacking intellectual background of this family, who were not only no travelers in the physical world, but probably also not adventurous explorers of the world of ideas, let alone inventors of new ideas. Or I think this is further supported by the reference to polite literature. I'm not totally sure about the definition of polite literature in the 19th century. Heather, you should be in a better position to explain, but I think this is mainly used to refer to light or even shallow entertainment. So definitely not books on intellectual matters or on groundbreaking new ideas. So that's, I think, the spirit of the family home of the Casaubons, nicely represented in this room, frozen in a bygone area without the slightest hint of creativity or openness of mind or any grandeur. So, and I like to share with you a screenshot from the 2008 BBC series on Middlemarch that shows this room in faded blue. And I think, yeah, that really gives an apt impression of a room where the colors are faded and everything was once arranged according to conventions, but yeah, now has come to a standstill. So that's a screenshot just taken with my cell phone camera from my TV. But I think you get an idea that this is, yeah, they are faded colors. It's not a room where some person has lived for a long time, and the person that lived there some times ago, you see that is sort of expressing a conventional type of taste.
That's the first time I've not seen the BBC adaptation all the way through. So yeah, it's interesting to see that paleness and the
Yeah,
coldness of
yeah,
choosing those colors. Huh.
yeah.
And so then it's interesting to hear Mr. Brooks' remark. Now we'll go back to the text again, because he says yes. He's, of course, he has to be polite as well. He said yes, this would be a pretty room with some new hangings, sofas, that sort of thing. A little bare now. And of course, Dorothea chimes in. She's still under this spell. Even says, pray do not speak of altering anything. There are so many other things in the world that want altering. I like to take these things as they are. And you like them as they are, don't you? She added, looking at Mr. Casaubon. Perhaps this was your mother's room when she was young. And at this point, he confirms it was. Now, my first thought was, oh, is it ever a good idea for a wife to inhabit the space that was once occupied by a mother in many, many different ways, literally, but also figuratively? We do not yet know whether, well, we do now, because David's told us she's going to get this room. I wasn't sure. I was holding out, wondering, well, I wonder if he'll let her have this room, because it was his mother's. I'm wondering if Casaubon had a very close relationship with his mother, then is he going to expect Dorothea to compensate for his loss? If he had a complicated relationship with his mother, will he transfer any frustration that he had about those complications and then vent them on his new wife whenever she does something unexpected? One way or another, it doesn't bode well, I don't think. And I do note that Eliot, she's constructed Casaubon's maternal line. Dorothea goes down to say, this is your mother, said Dorothea, who had turned to examine the group of miniatures. It is like the tiny one you brought me, which is interesting that he has given her a miniature of his mother. That's got to be one of the, I'm trying to think of, do I know anyone who received as an engagement gift something, maybe something that belonged to his mother? I can understand passing on a ring or a piece of jewelry, but he's given her a portrait of her. That also doesn't bode well. But she says, I should think this one's a better portrait. And this one opposite. Now she's asking about the portrait near his mother's. Who is this? And he says, her elder sister. They were, like you and your sister, the only two children of their parents who hang above them. I also think, okay, now Eliot's also constructed Casaubon's maternal family, his mother and his aunt, in the same situation that Dorothea and Celia are in. They are the only girls, just the two of them. And I thought, okay, well, we know Dorothea and Celia are very different, and we see them moving through their lives as different people. It's obviously setting up the fact that these two also contrast with each other, as we will see, because I'm going to bring up our next page. And we'll take it up to the top. And Celia remarks, the sister is pretty, said Celia, implying that she thought less favorably of Mr. Casaubon's mother. She thinks less favorably of a lot of things, so that's just one more she can add to her list. It was a new opening to Celia's imagination, however, that Casaubon came of a family who had all been young at one time. The ladies wearing necklaces. Well, there, of course, she's harking back to chapter 1, where you remember she got out their mother's jewels, and Dorothea initially was disparaging, almost sort of saying, well, we shouldn't wear them, that there was almost something unchristian. Celia interpreted that way, that there was something unchristian about the wearing of jewelry, and yet here, Mr. Casaubon, for the greatness of his soul, he seemed to have come from women who were capable of wearing necklaces. Celia's mind, I think that justifies it now. She can put the necklaces on if she wants to. Now, this I thought was interesting. Dorothea says, it is a peculiar face. Those deep grey eyes, rather near together, and the delicate, irregular nose with a sort of ripple in it. And I couldn't help thinking, you'll bear with me, Evan, because this is a flight of fancy on my part. But I'm going to just pull up one more picture. This comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica, a portrait from an engraving of George Eliot. And I couldn't help when I did see it. I thought, is she using her own face as a model? Because it's always been interesting to me, just because people's faces are interesting. The ridge bone of the nose isn't exactly straight. It curves ever so slightly. And I've always thought that George Eliot's eyes were ever so slightly. And I just thought, oh, she's modeling herself after Julia. I have no idea. But I'm speculating, because immediately she said that, I thought, oh, I know whose face that is. But we'll go back to the text now. And all the powdered curls hanging backward. I don't know enough about 18th century hair fashion to comment on how curls ought to hang, although it seems to me peculiar rather than pretty. This is Dorothy's opinion. There is not even a family likeness between her and your mother. Well, that disturbed me right away. I thought, oh, is there anything else we should know about this family? Well, we'll wait and find out. No, Casaubon says, and they were not alike in their lot. And Dorothea says, and interesting, you could put accusation in this if you want to. You did not mention her to me. I think you might. You gave me a miniature of your mother, but apparently she doesn't have a sister. My aunt made an unfortunate marriage. Of course, we talked about this in episode 18, but this is a new fact. I never saw her, which I can't help thinking of George Eliot's younger years, because, of course, from the time that she started her relationship with George Henry Lewis, and when it became known to her family, to her brother, because her father and mother were dead, but her brother was now head of the household, her brother cut her off completely. And I do believe, though, that Eliot sustained secret correspondence with one sister. I don't know if she's going to bring that into the story. I'm putting it out there for what it's worth. David, would you like to carry on?
Sure. Dorothea wondered a little, but felt that it would be indelicate just then to ask for any information which Mr. Casaubon did not proffer, and she turned to the window to admire the view. The sun had lately pierced the grey, and the avenue of limes cast shadows. "Shall we not walk in the garden now?" said Dorothea. So Dorothea does not feel free to ask for information. That's clear. She is, I think, quickly adapting to the more submissive role that will be expected of her in his house, but which she willingly submits to, and not giving in to her own inclinations, but waiting for Casaubon to provide explanation or guidance. And she's also not expressing directly her wish to return to the garden. She's just meekly putting it into a question: shall we not go? So interestingly, Mr. Brooke is the one sensible enough to notice that some change to a more cheerful scenery would be a good idea, and who comes then up with a specific suggestion. And Casaubon seems to lack the ingenuity of what to do next. And you would like to see the church, said Mr. Brooke. It's a droll little church. And the village. It all lies in a nutshell. By the way, it will suit you, Dorothea, for the cottages are like a row of almshouses, little gardens, gillyflowers, that sort of thing. So this is Mr. Brooke as we know him, looking for the nice things in life, talking about them in a superficial way and not taking anything too serious. I think a droll little church, I'm not sure whether droll is really an adequate attribute for a church, but anyway, that's Mr. Brooke how it is. And I think also an interesting thing is it was Casaubon who led the way into the blue room. Mr. Casaubon led the way thither, and it's Mr. Brooke who organizes their leave and their departure in search of a more lively scenery. So the whole scene of Dorothea's new life in her new room is framed by action of the male characters who are guiding Dorothea. So there's little action of her own going on here. And maybe it's stretching the point too far, but I think this sort of obvious that this whole scene is framed by one male introducing her into the room and the other leading her out. So yeah.
Absolutely. And we're going to end just after this next paragraph so you can see everyone. And that's only because there'll be a new character coming in, so it makes a natural cutting off point. Dorothea ends by saying, "Yes, please," to the garden. Looking at Mr. Casaubon, "I should like to see all that." And then this next sentence, as it starts, I think you could just turn this into a motto. She had got nothing from him. You could end it this. She had got nothing from him. Oh, in this case, more graphic about the Lowick cottages than that they were not bad. But this, I think the whole section that we've read now, is you feel the house has nothing to offer. Casaubon is barely offering himself. And even Dorothea, if it weren't for Celia, in fact, I don't know how Celia was strong-armed into coming on this visit. I suppose as bridesmaid, she's obligated to. But if it weren't for Celia finally almost calling out and going, someone in here has to take this in hand and has to have a will and a desire, there would be nothing. And this really does feel like an empty section, ghostly, dead. It reminds me of Great Expectations, where Pip wanders into Mrs. Haversham's house, that beautiful old house where she's still dressed as a bride, but is an old woman. It made me think of that. Places out of their time. At one time they were alive, and now they are just relics of something. But what we don't know what. That's the ghostly thing, is we don't know what is haunting this manor house, but you can't help but suspect that something is. And that's it, everyone. David, anything else you want to add before we
No, that
wrap up?
I think this was a little bit a session of Casaubon bashing, and I think this he really asks for it, and I think Eliot really provokes it here, and I think it's all well justified. But on the other hand, I also feel a little bit of sympathy for him because I think he also is sort of a victim of the limitations of his upbringing and of his character and of his somewhat limited intellectual capacities, which are not up to the task that he has made his mission in life. And so, yeah, I think there are a lot of indications that this is not going to be the happiest marriage ever.
True enough. Well, everybody, that is it for this episode of Middlemarch Meditations. Dave, thanks so much for joining us. There are things that you brought to this meditation I couldn't possibly have, and I think it's enriched it greatly. I'm really glad that you suggested this idea. What we'll do, everybody, I need to go away now and edit all this and make it YouTube ready, and then we will see you again. It should be March by then, so I hope that your reading goals for that month are going ahead as planned. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye from me.
Bye. Thank you.